Welcome to the Free Library of Philadelphia Online. I'm Andy Cahan, Director of Author Events, and I'm excited to welcome our guest this morning. Music critic for The New Yorker since 1996, Alex Ross is the author of the international bestseller, The Rest is Noise, Listening to the 20th Century, a trip down the rabbit hole of modern sound's biggest moments and personalities. It won the 2007 National Book Critics Circle Award and was a Pulitzer Prize finalist. Ross is also the author of Listen to This, an essay collection ranging in topic from Mozart to Led Zeppelin. A 2008 MacArthur Fellow and a 2015 Guggenheim Fellow, he is the recipient of the ASCAP Deems Taylor Award. In a recent review in the New York Times, composer John Adams writes that Ross's new book, Wagnerism, is a work of enormous intellectual range and subtle artistic judgment that pokes and probes the nerve endings of Western cultural and social norms as they are mirrored in more than a century of reaction to Wagner's works. Joining Alex this morning to discuss the book, we have acclaimed actor Simon Callow, perhaps best known on this side of the pond for films such as Amadeus, Shakespeare in Love, and Four Weddings and a Funeral, though he has appeared in scores of other movies, television shows, and stage plays. He has also directed a wide variety of stage productions of operas, musicals, and dramas for such institutions as the Old Vic, the Royal Shakespeare Company, and the Scottish Opera. An accomplished author, Callow has written at length about Charles Dickens, whom he has played on both stage and screen. He has also penned an acclaimed book on acting, biographies of Orson Welles, Oscar Wilde, and yes, Richard Wagner. Alex and Simon, the screen is all yours.
Alex, lovely to see you, first of all, after some while since we first, and indeed last, met in London when there was a whole season of concerts at the Royal Festival Hall inspired by The Rest is Noise, which is unique, I think. I can't imagine or think of a book which has inspired a whole concert series in that way. It was very successful and rather wonderful, wasn't it?
Yeah, it was an overwhelming experience, quite disorienting to, I'm used to being a kind of anonymous, skulking observer in the concert hall. To sort of be at the center of attention was very strange, but hugely gratifying. And I'm so grateful to South Bank for having put that together.
You could almost inspire a season called Wagnerism as well. It wouldn't just be music. It would be philosophy and literature and painting and stagecraft. So this time you've taken on surprisingly, one wouldn't have thought it was possible, but you've taken on an even more compendious subject than the last one.
Yes, even more foolish. A Wagnerism season would be interesting. People could pack the hall for reading a recitation of Mallarmé's Wagner sonnet and other hits. This book is really not about Wagner per se. I mean, it's about this. I feel as though it's really about this moment in time, the fin de siècle, sort of the end of the 19th century, early 20th century, when there was a religion of art, sort of an enormous faith in art's capacity to change the world and to bring about transformations, and not only social transformations, but spiritual transformations. And Wagner was kind of all the kind of mighty figures in that period, Wagner was the one in whom, for better or worse, people had the most faith. There was this sense that Wagner had unleashed something enormous. And so I studied sort of all of these figures who were in Wagner's shadow in one way or another, sort of affected by Wagner, but also just very much about this period, sort of the end of Romanticism, the birth of modernism, the sort of the mighty forces that were at work in the arts, sort of transforming the arts themselves and the world around them. And so Wagner is just the sort of jumping off point, for this sort of cultural history of the period. But it is enormous because, in this span of time, say from around 1880 to 1914, there were very few major figures who are not affected by Wagner in one way or another, even if they chose to reject him or sort of had this very distant relationship with him. Nonetheless, Mallarmé, Proust, Thomas Mann, Virginia Woolf, T.S. Eliot, James Joyce, Kandinsky, George Eliot, even just the list goes absolutely on and on. So it was a very long, it's a very long index. Sort of the names, who sort of crop up in one way or another. It's just,
but as you say, it was necessary. Wagner was a phenomenon of such force that it was necessary, particularly, of course, for musicians, to react one way or the other. And many musicians embraced Wagnerism. Many rejected it completely for fear that they were going to drown in it somehow. It seems to me that this is completely unique. I don't know if you can think of any other composers, certainly, who had that kind of effect. People didn't have to react one way or another to Beethoven or to Brahms, did they? Or to Mozart. It's a fascinating phenomenon.
Yeah, well, in music, certainly there have been a string of figures in music with whom, other composers, later composers, have had to come to terms in something like the same way. Especially if you look at Beethoven. And, Beethoven was a very problematic figure for a lot of composers of the time and immediately after, because there was sort of a great shift taking place, just in terms of how a musical work unfolded and the demands that Beethoven's work made on the performers and on the audience. And sort of going back further, there was a sort of enormous controversy around Monteverdi and the kind of musical shift that Monteverdi signified, and Bach was a figure who didn't arouse a great deal of discussion in his own time, but afterward, of course, became just an absolutely gigantic figure and continues to be so for sort of every composer today. So if you're just looking sort of within music, the reverberations with Wagner are certainly intense. But not sort of dramatically more so than with any number of other composers. But where it becomes singular and unprecedented is this effect outside of music. And so my book is entirely about Wagner's impact outside of music. I chose to set aside the question of how he affected composers because, A, the book would have been twice as long, and it's already too long, and B, just the phenomenon just wasn't as interesting really within music as it was outside of music. And so why did this composer have such effect on novelists, poets, theater thinkers, dancers, choreographers, painters, architects, and on and on. And sort of that's the mystery of the book, really, which I'm not sure I ever sort of come up with a concise answer to. It was almost more the sort of weather system that sort of began moving across the cultural landscape, and just sort of it just took on this momentum of its own.
What's extraordinary, as the book makes so clear, is how influential it was in ways that you couldn't possibly have conceived for the impact of not simply a composer, but of course a composer of operas, and therefore who also wrote his own libretti. So there's a whole verbal and philosophical element which is added into this. But this simple idea, which he didn't seem to care about nearly as much as many of his followers, this idea of the Gesamtkunstwerk, the total work of art, which he essentially drew from the Greek theatre. This even went so far as I was astounded to discover that town planners were influenced by this. Now, that's absolutely extraordinary. Just the idea of an integrated conception, which was absolutely identified with Wagner, could be transferred into even an area like that.
Yeah. Well, yeah, I mean, Wagner was sort of this cluster of ideas and impulses, and the music was at the center, of course, and the music was sort of at the core of the spell that he cast, because, on their own, his prose writings would not have attracted so much attention if there hadn't been the kind of force of the music behind them. The texts, the librettos are interesting, but hardly immortal literary documents that kind of command attention on their own. So it's the music that's sort of impelling all of this. But, the texts, he did have a strong effect as a dramatist, as a sort of constructor, architect of sort of theatrical events. He had an effect as a sort of a theoretician about the theater and sort of how people behave in the theater. I mean, he was sort of a part-time architect in terms of how the Festspielhaus in Bayreuth came about, and the particular energy that's there, and then the sort of impulse to sort of focus the audience's attention entirely on this stage, and the orchestra is hidden. And there's a very, very different kind of atmosphere from other theaters of the time. And then, yes, the theoretical writings. And so he throws out an idea like the Gesamtkunstwerk, which is not really pursued in his own work beyond the combination of words and music, which is what opera is, So, I mean, there was something very, sort of banal about the idea as he articulated, just in sort of terms of the opera house, because sort of this is what opera composers had already been trying to do, for centuries. Yeah. But somehow, just by throwing it out there, it took hold, and sort of people began applying it in new contexts. So Camillo Sitte, the Austrian architect and sort of urban designer, was seeking this completely integrated city space that would sort of break down the border between kind of pedestrian and sort of street and shop and sort of building, and create this Gemeinschaft, this community. And he was very much inspired by basically every town of the present was supposed to be like Nuremberg in Meistersinger, where the cobbler is also a singer, and the sort of the street and sort of the border between the street and the interior is sort of fuzzy, and sort of the sort of public life takes place in this transparent way when everyone is participating, and so this word, that Wagner actually only used 5 times in 2 essays and then sort of set aside. Exactly. By the beginning of the 20th century, becomes this enormous, the Bauhaus is sort of pursuing Gesamtkunstwerk ideas, and in the cinema, the sort of Gesamtkunstwerk sort of takes on a life of its own. And then now, this kind of a multimedia, sort of digital age Gesamtkunstwerk concept. So, so he was a great sloganeer, a great kind of, a great sort of coiner of phrases, that sort of almost without him intending it.
Yes, and of course we obviously have to mention the most notorious thing that he ever wrote, verbally speaking, which was Das Judentum in Musik, this famous Jewishness in music, this little piece that he wrote for some small magazine, which very quickly went, as we would say, viral, and as it's an explicit account of an explicit exposition of the idea of a Jewishness which was dangerous and a symptom of a rotten culture which had to be extirpated, that Jews were essentially mimics, could never create anything fresh and original. They lived off the body of music. This thing that he wrote, just sort of tossed off quickly, became extremely dangerously influential.
Yeah. Well, it's important to note that, I mean, it became viral because Wagner himself made it viral. He republished it, so the sequence of events, I think, is very important. In 1850, he writes this essay for the Neue Zeitschrift für Musik, which is an important musical magazine, had been founded by Schumann, but was not terribly widely read. So sort of under 1,000 people probably read this piece at the time. It was published anonymously, so it was not immediately associated with Wagner. And if he had left it at that, this article would eventually have just disappeared from discourse, and today, of course, as historians of Wagner, we would be paying attention to it. But in his own lifetime, it would have sort of passed from memory. But he chose to republish it 19 years later under his own name as a pamphlet with an afterword which only intensified the ugliness, the odiousness of the vocabulary. And that was the moment at which sort of Wagner became infamous for his anti-Semitism and influential for his anti-Semitism, because you have a figure of that renown. And again, back in 1850, Wagner was hardly obscure, but he was in exile. He was a controversial figure, and it just didn't have the same kind of impact as it did in 1869, where he was now becoming the titan, the cultural titan of the new German Empire, which was about to be founded. And so it had a completely different impact. And yeah, it's a dangerous document. Exactly how it affected subsequent anti-Semitism in German-speaking lands is somewhat difficult to parse, because it is by Wagner, and therefore it is eccentric and strange and contradictory. This essay, and then some later essays in which he elaborated his anti-Semitic ideas, this work was not necessarily easily adaptable to the really vulgar, sort of pseudo-scientific biological anti-Semitism of sort of the late 19th century, early 20th century. So someone like Houston Stewart Chamberlain, who an Englishman who became German, and who wrote this best-selling racist tract, Foundations of the 19th Century, was a great Wagnerite, but actually made little use of Wagner's anti-Semitic writings because he found them too inconsistent and contradictory, and amateurish, really. Wagner was an amateur at racism. Chamberlain was professional. And so I think the influence was a bit more oblique. It wasn't that the people were copying and reciting Wagner's anti-Semitism. It's just that his reputation lent a dignity to this horrific kind of mode of thought in a way that's, it's just something we can't quite quantify, but the consequences were terrible.
But as you say, Wagner's always eccentric and always erratic and very often contradictory of himself. And in that instance, of course, many of his closest associates were Jewish. And most notably, in fact, the people who helped him most were Jewish, starting with Meyerbeer and going on, and the impresario of the first tour of the Ring, Angelo Neumann, and indeed the conductor of Parsifal were all Jewish. And he was quite explicit in his avowals of anti-Semitism to their face, and yet continued to work with them, admire them. When Levi, who conducted Parsifal, went to his flat in Venice, the flat where he died, and stayed with him for a couple of weeks, Wagner embraced him and said, "You're, always dear to me. I love you deeply and thank you kindly for everything." It's fascinating.
It's a very strange kind of psychological situation, or maybe not so strange. This anti-Semite who felt this really compulsion to sort of have Jews around him. So it wasn't just that he had a few Jewish friends. He was actually actively dependent on Jews and sort of sought them out, or they sought him out. And Meyerbeer sort of, I think, is at the root of it. Wagner was the kind of person for whom it is dangerous to do a favor. Because if you do a favor for Wagner, then Wagner owes you a debt. And sort of a man of Wagner's narcissism and megalomania, it's just sort of the idea that someone else actually was crucial to the development of his career, as Meyerbeer was, sort of created a problem. And I think that is, to some extent, the root of the rage, but it's difficult to psychologize. It wasn't just Wagner himself. I mean, it was a systemic issue in German society, in European society. This hostility toward the Jews was building everywhere. So you can see it in personal terms, but also in social terms. And so Wagner was also emblematic of this sort of wider trend. But I'd love to ask you about sort of Wagner's personality, because you've inhabited Wagner. You have let yourself become a conduit for Wagner. And what is that like? And how would you just sort of characterize his personality, just in a few swift strokes?
It's as you say, it's a strange place to be inside Wagner's head. It's a kind of a seesaw, a whirligig. Things there isn't. I think we said this in an exchange of emails a while ago, that there isn't anything that you can say about Wagner of which the opposite is not also true.
Mhm.
So he was incredibly vain and dictatorial and explosive, but equally he was capable of extraordinary kindness and generosity, and all his political positions changed constantly. At one point he was a monarchist, the next minute he was on the barricades. And this goes right through to the very end. And I can't, like you said earlier, in the end, it's quite hard to pin his influence down, or indeed him down. All that I'm aware of, the thing that in the end I think I ended up having to admire greatly, is that he remained absolutely and totally loyal to his talent all the way through his career. So through the most impossible reverses, desperate poverty, complete rejection, exile, many of these things he'd brought on himself, by the way. But anyway, despite every single setback, he just carried on serving the thing that he knew he had inside him. I mean, there's an extraordinary moment, which is probably apocryphal since it comes from his own autobiography, but nonetheless, where he saw the singer whom he admired more than any other in the world when he was still a boy, when he was 18, and he hated opera up to that point. He saw her in this opera singing Fidelio, and he immediately knew that being an opera composer was his destiny. He went backstage to see her, said to her, "I will write something for you. I'm not capable of it now, but one day I will write something wonderful for you." And he did, in a sense. She was in Rienzi, which we don't do much now, but he did actually honor his sense of himself. And I think, although he had a very rackety life, behaved atrociously, immorally, and drank intemperately a lot of the time, he always made sure that he was serving his talent. He always nurtured whatever it was that was within him. And he didn't start writing the music until he'd got the libretto absolutely as he meant it to be. He would publish the texts sometimes years before he actually started writing the music. And when the moment came, he would write it. And that moment sometimes came in the most extraordinary, at the time of his worst reverses, when he had 5 unperformed massive operas in his satchel. He started writing the Master Singers of Nuremberg. Just absolutely, I mean, that huge, a 5.5-hour opera, which is one of the sunniest things he ever wrote, not without its shadows, of course, because he was Wagner. But so he's a constantly paradoxical figure.
Yeah. I think, in the Victorian period, he was much acclaimed for his industriousness, which is sort of, it seems a little odd now because we think of Wagner as chaotic, and so sort of kind of undisciplined, in certain ways. But those were one of the sort of the chief virtues that the Victorians saw in Wagner, and it's actually absolutely right. I mean, there is this aspect of Wagner where he sort of had an idea, and then he pursued it to its conclusion. And already in the 1840s, he had mapped out sort of ideas for Meistersinger, for Parsifal, and sort of while the sort of seeds of the ring were also gathering. And so he sort of has this initial idea for Parsifal and sort of sets it aside, and then sort of 30 years later he picks it up again. And so the sense that sort of how even as a very young man he had sort of pretty much plotted out his mature work.
And not only the work, but he also knew that they would have to have certain conditions for it to be properly performed, and he made sure that happened. And by whatever means, and partly it involved Ludwig II for a while, and then when they fell out, he did it on his own, more or less. He actually created this ideal theatre, which was necessary for his work to be seen as he envisaged it. And he set out, when people requested the scores when they were going to do the work, he sent out a document saying, this is how you have to do this piece. It has to be done exactly like this, or it won't work. It'll be boring and bad if you do it any other way. And although, I mean, probably that isn't true scenically speaking, but in terms of the way the operas were rehearsed, the relationship of the singers to the lyrics, the words, were absolutely. He was absolutely right about that. And again, we think of him as, because of the grandeur of the scale of his work, that we think of him as in some sort of way bombastic, but almost everything he ever said to the singers, the conductors, and the orchestral players was, quiet, play it gently, play it delicately, play it exquisitely. You know, there was that big sign in the orchestra pit in Bayreuth just saying, quiet, even before they started to play a note. I mean, these are all curious aspects of a very curious man.
Well, he was a great man of the theater, which I assume is, as you are yourself a great man of the theater, I assume this is sort of part of the attraction with Wagner, so not just the music, but the fact that at the beginning, is sort of something I found myself saying a lot as I've talked about this book, is Wagner began as this kid who wanted to put on shows. He would write the text and he would act them out and sort of make little kind of costumes and sort of scenes for those.
Yeah.
And this is what he proceeded to do his entire life. He was putting on shows. And so he was a man of the theater who wrote the music and the texts for his own shows, and then conceived of the theater in which they would be played, and directed the shows and conducted the orchestra, So it was this one-man band to...
Yes. And don't forget that also he performed his own pieces personally. He was a very, very bad pianist, but he hammered his way through the whole of the Ring cycle, singing all the parts. And everybody who attended those sessions said, "It's sublime."
Or he would just be reciting the text. I mean, one scene that I allude to in my book, which fascinates me, is when in London in 1877, he came for the Wagner Festival at Royal Albert Hall, and held a reading of the newly finished text of Parsifal. And he simply recited the text. There was no music yet. And it was 2 hours or longer, however long it took for him to get through it. And it was done at Edward Dannreuther's house. And George Eliot was there, and sort of a number of other notables. It was in German, of course. And it was said to have been an absolutely riveting experience. And you would think that sort of listening to someone read aloud the libretto of Parsifal would not necessarily be a riveting experience. But somehow, and so you wonder, what was that like? What was he like as a reciter, as an actor?
Well, everybody who ever saw any of those performances, either the musical ones or just the librettos, said, had he chosen to be, he would have been the greatest actor of his time. He was tiny, very unprepossessing physically, but he had the great actor's genius of transforming totally. And there are wonderful stories about in the original rehearsals of The Ring, where showing Sieglinde how she should play a certain scene, he simply became Sieglinde, and everybody just wept because it was so exquisite, so perfectly achieved. And then, typically of Wagner, he did a somersault, ran off the stage. He was very proud of the fact that as a boy, he'd fallen in with some acrobats, and he learned how to do all these strange physical things. He used to sometimes scale the wall of Wahnfried when he was in his, 60s. He's not as others, it has to be said. I don't think there's anybody that I've ever come across that remotely resembles Wagner. He's just an absolute one-off.
Yeah. Although, as if you're going to sort of completely derail our discussion and sort of swerve in a different direction,
Yeah.
but I want to ask you about Orson Welles,
Ah.
because I personally am deeply fascinated by Orson Welles, and wrote an article a few years back for the New Yorker about him, and here talking to the world's greatest authority, perhaps, on Welles, although we know there are any number of other people who would contest sort of want that title, but this I want to show this absolutely monumental achievement. So far, 3 volumes of the biography of Welles. But what fascinates me, I think, when sort of we put Welles next to Wagner, is that there are some likenesses here. You know, people of very different worlds, very different inclinations, and yet there's something about the sort of the two of them, how they, you know, obviously this enormous ability, this sort of ability in many different areas, sort of working together. There's the one-man band aspect. And then sort of the capacity of both of them to just kind of cause trouble, to sort of, you know, infuriate people around them, to sort of leave this sort of trail of human wreckage behind them in many ways, and yet at the same time to be transfixing and to sort of inspire love and admiration in people around them. Never mind, you know, sort of
Yeah.
specters. So I mean, do you see?
Well,
thread there?
Everything you say is true, but the trajectory of their lives is exactly opposite. So Wells was, from the cradle, told that he was a genius, and
Right.
he had the extraordinary good luck to go to the right school, where he was given access to the theatre, to a captive company of actors, in other words, his fellow students, a wonderful light rig and so on. And he practiced his craft as a 13 and 14 and 15-year-old, so that by the time that he was discovered by chance, but he had so much luck. At the age of 17, Thornton Wilder met him at a party and had heard that he'd appeared in a play in Dublin and put him in touch with Catherine Cornell, and he was playing Mercutio to Catherine Cornell when he was 18, which is just inconceivable. Not very well, I gather, but was spotted by John Houseman, and he invited him to work for the WPA, and he directed, as a result of that, the Negro Macbeth when he was 21, in, as it was called then, in Harlem, but immediately became almost world famous. So one thing after another, culminating in Citizen Kane, was just of one continuous success after another. Everything that looked as if it would turn out badly turned out well. And then his decline started with the collapse of, failure of Magnificent Ambersons, the collapse of It's All True in Brazil, and his being shunned by Hollywood for years, his going into exile in Europe, and from then on being a mendicant, basically, just as, of course, Wagner was, but to less effect. He only managed to scrape together enough support to do, in the end, to have made 8 films altogether. And it simply, if you compare his career with someone like John Huston, it's just a tenth of what he should have produced. Wagner, meanwhile, having started this wretched kid that nobody knew what to do with, who behaved disgracefully, was thrown out of university, and bit by bit, slowly, by incredibly hard work, dragged himself up. But unlike Wells, I think, remained absolutely true, as I said, to his own light. He knew there was a sort of still center in Wells, in Wagner, a still center, despite all the kind of fireworks going on the outside. There was not that center in Wells. Wells was struggling a great deal of the time. The talent, the genius, if you like, was absolutely there in Wells, but the self-belief wasn't, which is a surprise to anybody who starts to work on him, because he looks like the most confident man in the world, but he isn't. He's full of raging doubts, which never, ever, ever troubled Wagner at all. If he thought, as he did when he'd finished Lohengrin, he thought, and which was, he didn't actually hear the first performance of it, but it was a great success, and of course became world famous. He said, no, this is the music of the past. I've got to think it through all over again. Took 2 years out to just think, read, and write about the new music form of the future. So he had that ability to retrench, and meanwhile managed to find patrons to look after him, basically. Even though he did experience great poverty at times, and of course found the greatest patron of them all in Ludwig. But he just built steadily and steadily, becoming more and more ambitious in his work, from Tristan to The Ring to finally Parsifal, of course, with master singers somewhere there in the middle. It seemed that he was inexhaustible. And Wells, with all the talents that he had, was unable to access that kind of stamina, that artistic and indeed perhaps just ordinary human stamina, you know?
Yeah, no, that sounds quite right to me. I mean, I would also say that in some sense it's a tale of 2 centuries, because Wagner is a man of the 19th century and is coming into his own, just as I was saying before, this religion of art, this bourgeois worship of art and artists was sort of reaching its zenith, and sort of carried on through the end of the century as this phenomenon of Wagnerism spread and spread. You know, by the 1930s, when the young Wells is coming along, this religion of art is subsiding, and especially in America, and sort of amid American popular culture, where the idea of this single genius carrying messages from the beyond, you know, is giving way to a more populist and also sort of a more collaborationist, not collaborationist in that sense, collaborative mentality. You know, the band, the sort of the group work, you know, or the genius who is, you know, also kind of perfectly representative of popular feeling. You know, as opposed to, there was this great antagonism with Wells. You know, there was this great kind of contrarian streak, and in fact, I think one of the best things about him was his adversarial political stance, and his refusal to make the kind of work that would have sort of instantly kind of won over a big public. And so that, you know, but Wagner had the same thing. Of course, Wagner was also contrarian and antagonistic, and yet I think within that atmosphere, within the setting of the 19th century, he was nonetheless able to break through. He was an avant-garde artist who became a popular one, which is a very
well, yes, exactly. I mean, and he created the taste for his own music. He educated the public into it, because think of all those years when all those scores were lying, repining, unperformed. He performed orchestral extracts around the world. People came to long to hear this music of his. And eventually he found a situation where it could be done to his satisfaction. But Wells, I think you're absolutely right, though, of course, about the suspicion of genius. I mean, that was exactly what they said when Wells was thrown out of RKO. The big sign was "No more geniuses."
That's the 20th century writ large, I suppose. No more geniuses.
I mean, Wells would have been the first person, the first person to deny being a genius. He didn't actually think of himself as a genius, but he did think that he had a unique talent, a unique view, and unique way of making movies. And he's right about that. Of course he did. And that never really left him. It was the context that he was flummoxed by studio bosses whom he was much brighter than. I mean, he was outwitted constantly by dull people who ran studios, because he wouldn't, unlike, I mean, Wagner also wouldn't make any concessions of any kind, but Wagner was shrewd enough to when he met Ludwig of Bavaria, to know that this was going to be a route on the way to achieving his dream. But Wells didn't really have that sort of nous. He didn't have that. It was I think, myself, what I think, but Wells had a kind of aristocratic, a rather princely view of himself. He did rather expect people to come to him and, obviously recognize him for what he was. But Wagner never thought that. He went in with both fists, fighting all the way. He was a little runt from Leipzig. He knew that,
Yeah, he had a streetwise kind of aspect to him.
Yeah.
We're being encouraged to move to the questions, and there's some quite fascinating questions that have come up. And the first one is quite challenging indeed. John Roman asks, for Wagner, what is the purpose of art? Which is a fascinating question. I'll throw it to you, Simon, because
thank you. Thanks a lot, Alex. Well, I mean, as Alex has implied, Wagner saw art as the supreme activity of the human being, and it was himself, and the claim he made for himself was that he was an artist and a supremely gifted artist, and therefore a space should be made for him. He believed that art was the fulfillment of the whole of human culture and human society, and that the artist was at the pinnacle. And guess what? He happened to be an artist, so he should be at the pinnacle. It was a faith rather than an analysis.
Yeah, there is a contradiction in terms of, what is the purpose? And of course, Wagner was very voluble in terms of sort of naming these extraordinary goals that his work was supposed to achieve, whether in terms of sort of bringing about a revolution in humanity, or crowning a revolution in humanity, or sort of toward the end of his life, something even bigger, sort of a spiritual transformation of humanity, sort of in the deepest sense, and on, sort of various other sort of less grandiose but still ambitious purposes that the art was supposed to serve. And yet, I mean, I do go back to that idea that Wagner was putting on a show, and there's something very practical about the fact that he simply wanted to sort of hold an audience spellbound for a certain period of time while he was telling a story. What the consequences of that experience would be, what the purpose of that experience would be, was somewhat up for debate, and I think was deliberately left undefined in some ways. And I think particularly when we look to myth and Wagner's manipulation of myth, and his very conscious decision in 1848 to shift from operas that had a historical basis or semi-historical basis to purely mythic stories, which is what The Ring was. He made this decision in order to expand the reach of his work. So the historical opera was limited in its reach. Myth had infinite reach. And he said this very concisely and beautifully in a writing career that was otherwise short on concision and beauty. But he said, myth is true for all time. And it represents sort of fundamental human relationships in this concentrated form. And that is how the operas proceeded to sort of play out in subsequent culture and subsequent political history. Everyone had their own reading. And there's something quite amazing which happens with Wagner, where, at the beginning of the process, he seems to be overpowering and domineering. He is the all-powerful artist dictating every aspect of the experience and how everything should be done. And yet, on the other side, the spectator who seems passive, so many people complained, we're made too passive by the experience of Wagner. Nietzsche said this, countless others. And yet, on the other end, there's this incredible freedom of spectators to have interpreted Wagner in so many different ways, in so many different directions, politically, culturally, Black Wagnerians, Jewish Wagnerians, feminist, communist, socialist, et cetera, early gay rights activists sort of seizing upon Wagner for inspiration. And so Wagner, in the end, is overwhelmed by his spectators, is dominated by his spectators. And so the question of what the purpose of all this
Well,
becomes exceedingly vague, or sort of exceedingly.
I think you could perhaps relate it back to his connection with Greek drama, and even from boyhood, he was plugged into, especially Sophocles and Euripides, and Aeschylus were his great gods, and what he believed or came to believe in that moment when he stopped writing and tried to figure out what it was he was really trying to do was that he wanted to connect to the unconscious, to the subconscious. And when he said quite early on, when he wrote the overture to the Flying Dutchman, he said, this is the first, and he'd already written, of course, Rienzi before that, and Das Liebesverbot, and Defend, four operas before that. He said, this is the first piece of music I have written which comes from my subconscious, not from my conscious. And that was the whole notion of Bayreuth, was that it should be a kind of temple where you were able to surrender your conscious mind and connect to the unconscious. And his stagecraft was all about that. I mean, his vision of the Rhine maidens, you're in this completely darkened auditorium and you hear these terrible, great bassoons and deep, deep notes of the E flat at the beginning of the ring cycle. There's nothing happening. And then the Rhine maidens float into your mind, your eye, as if from a dream. And you're suddenly, you shed all the ordinariness of logical thinking, and you're in touch with your real self. And this is the aspect of Wagner that, of course, is very potentially very dangerous. It's a kind of a it suspends logic, it suspends rationality, and it gives in to the whole point of all of his work was ultimately, as far as he was concerned, to connect to the German soul. And the German soul, it isn't nationalism, it isn't patriotism, because actually he rather despised the German Empire when it properly came into being, partly because, of course, they didn't give him any money. But that was, but what he was really about was he believed that he personally was the conduit of the German spirit, the German soul. Well, it's a very odd thing that. It's hard. It's not a political idea. It's something much deeper. And that's why he went towards the myths, to the Nordic and the German myths, to try to somehow connect. And that was, of course, his argument against the Jews, that they don't have roots in our country, so they can't possibly do what a German artist is supposed to do, which is to express its soul. They couldn't do that. So that, I mean, that's an elaborate and long answer, but it's part of what he meant by art.
Yeah. And I think here we're also sort of beginning to answer another question that came up from Tom Wamser. When I think of Wagner, I think of his music as the ultimate expression of Germanic triumphalism. Is that a fair understanding of his music, or is that more a function of how his music was subsequently used by others? And so you were touching upon this, and for me, this is a difficult question to answer. Yes, there is this way in which Wagner wanted to be, or saw himself as, the conduit for the German soul, for the folk, the spirit of the folk, and the word folk sort of hovers between sort of national people and race. And by the time of the Nazis, the operative phrase was Volksgemeinschaft, popular community, but their folk, of course, is being used very much in a racial sense. And so there's a very troubling sort of aspect to that. But at the same time, as you're saying, this is not necessarily political nationalism. And so it's sort of more ambiguous in terms of its implication. But, is that ultimately what Wagner is about? For me, I don't think I could quite accept that sort of that ultimately Wagner is about Germanic triumphalism.
Certainly, he would never have accepted that phrase.
Yeah. Wagner was also a European artist, and there's something about Wagner that is always homeless, always wandering, always an outsider. And so, as much as he talked about the perfect, German community and the sort of longing for this sort of ideal Germany, he never found it. He never saw it, and it certainly wasn't the Kaiserreich. He disliked Prussian militarism,
Yeah.
and this idea of a sort of the militarized state with a standing army was actually anathema to him. And so this is an aspect of his politics that is utterly contrary to the totalitarian Germany which emerged in the 20th century. It's difficult to imagine that he would have accepted such a thing. And yet Wagner inspired Hitler, inspired the Nazis with this mystical conception of the eternal German spirit. So it's quite difficult to answer. But
it's worth saying at this point, isn't it, that of course Hitler seems sometimes, when one reads the record, virtually the only Nazi who actually liked Wagner's music. I mean, there was a strong feeling that, first of all, it was way above the head of most of the party faithful, whom Hitler invited them all to go and see. I think it was Meistersinger or something, and they just got drunk and behaved disgracefully and left the theatre at the interval. And so he said that's the end of that for them. But also there's the limitations. Wagner's range is vast. So Parsifal was banned during the war completely, and and everybody felt that there was latent Marxism in all the thinkers in the party thought there was latent Marxism in the Ring. And so they were extremely uncomfortable with that. As it happens, the opera that Hitler himself loved most of all of Wagner's was Rienzi, which is a very straightforward account of just populism, you know.
Yeah. So Parsifal was, I mean, it could still be played, but it wasn't.
Not at Bayreuth, anyway.
Parsifal certainly had caused trouble, you know, and of course, because this is the opera that sort of praises compassion above all other virtues, Mitleid, the ability to feel with and sort of take sorrow, feel other people's sorrow. Other people's pain. And especially once the war began, this was explicitly something that Hitler and other members of the Nazi hierarchy warned Germans against, this very word, Mitleid. Set it aside. You cannot afford this feeling because we are undertaking the most barbaric action in human history. And so Parsifal was problematic in that way. The tragic grandeur of the Ring became problematic. And there were other Nazis aside from Hitler who appreciated Wagner, or even loved Wagner, but there were some who found him ideologically inadequate. Alfred Rosenberg, for example, the so-called party philosopher, felt that there was something off about Wagner, something suspect, and a number of people felt he was too bohemian. There's something sexually obscure about Wagner. Too many Jews had been around him in Bayreuth. There was a rumor that Wagner was himself Jewish, or sort of that there was Jewish ancestry in the Wagner family, which continued spreading. This was a rumor actually that Nietzsche helped sort of launch into circulation. False. There was no Jewish ancestry with Wagner, but nonetheless, the idea took hold. And there's an extraordinary letter that Winifred Wagner wrote to Heinrich Himmler, begging him to somehow put a stop to this talk about Wagner's Jewish ancestry. Winifred Wagner, the widow of Siegfried, Wagner's son, who ran Bayreuth during the Nazi period. But let's sort of try to get in a couple more questions, and I'll sort of link these two together. Do any of you worry that the current culture will walk away from Wagner in the coming years because of his racist beliefs? And very much related, what is your opinion of the Israel Philharmonic barring playing Wagner? Do they still do? And these are, of course, very, very big questions. It's something, you know, with this book, it's come up again and again. What are we to do with Wagner now in the age of cancel culture and sort of the age of so many problematic artists living and dead being re-examined and sort of treated more censoriously? And my answer to this has been, well, with Wagner, people have been attempting to cancel Wagner since the 1850s. You know, so this is a very, very long-standing issue. Is Wagner too horrible in his beliefs for us to sort of actually listen to him? Literally, this has been asked since the 1850s. And so there obviously is something with Wagner that compels attention, you know, despite those odious beliefs. And there's this long history of grappling with these very questions. And I think it's sort of quite healthy. The discourse around Wagner has long been contentious and antagonistic. Even people who are Wagner admirers and Wagner experts constantly question Wagner and sort of constantly sort of ponder these problems. And for me, Thomas Mann has always been sort of the great figure, the perfect Wagnerite, to appropriate George Bernard Shaw's phrase, because his passion was always so infused with ambivalence and with doubt. And nonetheless, he kept listening. And so this is how I approach Wagner today. And so we have now this history, long history of grappling with this very question.
There's a very difficult fundamental question here, which is, can music be racist, is the question. And there's, as far as I'm aware, nothing in the libretti of Wagner's operas which is actually explicitly racist. You can conclude that that the Alberich and the Nibelungs are dwelling below the ground are in some sense, some sort of parody way Jewish, but that's been contested by almost everybody. Similarly, is Beckmesser in Meistersinger supposed to be Jewish? There's a fairly a large number of books written proposing that he is, but I don't see any evidence for that, really. So can the music as such be, or are we in our cancel culture in a state where it isn't to do with what you've actually written, but it's your attitudes, which are ultimately disqualify you from being heard? That's the tricky area where we're in at the moment, and that's certainly happening a lot in an attempt at a moment in London to remove one of the statues from St. Paul's Cathedral because the man depicted in it was a shareholder in a slave company. And the argument against that is, but the work of art is nothing to do with racism at all. It's simply that the man in question happened to hold shares. Is the statue to be destroyed because of that? That's the argument, and that's the only argument that would apply to Wagner in this case.
Yeah, I mean, my feeling is very much that Wagner was an extraordinary case in terms of the violence of his rhetoric, the fact that he wrote an entire essay and republished this essay spouting his anti-Semitic beliefs. It was just more vociferous and more explicit than with sort of most other figures around whom questions of anti-Semitism or racism or misogyny have arisen. And yet, still, the issue is fundamentally systemic, and we shouldn't personalize it. And I'm wary of the attitude that sort of makes Wagner out to be sort of such an extraordinarily awful person, personally, politically, et cetera, that he just belongs in a totally different category. And I think with that kind of demonization, we lose track of the deeper issue, which is the systemic nature of these feelings. It's not a matter of a few bad apples running around and kind of spoiling, a sort of society and culture. It goes much deeper than that. And so, of course, if you look through all of musical history, you'll find any number of problematic figures. I mean, Handel owned shares in a slavery company. There's racism in the Mozart operas in an explicit way that there isn't in Wagner when you look at Monostatos in the Magic Flute. Yeah. Chopin was an anti-Semite. Tchaikovsky was an anti-Semite, unfortunately. So it's very widespread, and this doesn't mean at all either that we, of course, erase all of these figures and stop playing them, nor does it mean that we cover it up and apologize for it and say, well, this was just how people felt during these eras, and we don't need to deal with it. We do need to deal with it. We just need to have the kind of frame of mind where we can take in that complexity and allow ourselves to have the freedom to develop our own relationships with the work, and take the work into our own worlds and use it for whatever purpose. We don't need to be dictated by the context of whatever beliefs were initially attached to these works. And yet we should also just keep it in mind and sort of not idealize unduly. And I think this is something that Wagner teaches us. not to idealize art. I mean, this is no longer possible to sort of treat Wagner as a god, as he once was. And I think that's healthy, to have that kind of detachment and sort of complexity in our relationship with any artist, because just, making a religion of art is always dangerous, I think, however much we want to allow ourselves to have that kind of deep, desperate love.
But personally, I don't think that Wagner saw himself as a god. He was quite aware of his flaws, not anti-Semitism. He didn't think that was a flaw, but he was aware of many, many other flaws. I think part of what happened with Wagner, and what continues to happen with Wagner, probably always will, is that because he's aimed at our subconscious, he gets in under the wire, and he affects us at a terribly deep level. And people do have experiences listening to Wagner, which are, I think, unlike the experiences they have with any other composer. And I went to a performance of Tristan at Bayreuth. I was quite close to the front. I was in the third row, and man in the front row, a tall, nicely put together, well-dressed man, sat down pleasantly. He was talking to his neighbors and so on. Within literally 4 bars of the music, he started shaking, and he shook literally all the way through the first act. And in the second act, he started sobbing, and he left at the second interval because he just couldn't handle it anymore. I mean, and he does that. Wagner does that to people. He's done it to me, and I think he's done it to you, Alex, and he's done it to many people. So that's why people think of him as sort of supreme in some way that is beyond, it's almost uncanny, it's beyond our comprehension. But that's something we have to deal with. I mean,
yeah, he was some sort of magician, the Death's Zauberer, as Nietzsche called him. Well, I think unfortunately we've begun to exceed our allotted time, so we should wrap things up.
I just have to ask one question. Sorry, but one of the questions on the Q&A is, please discuss the role of Jeanette Thurber in the popularization of Wagner in the US. Who is Jeanette Thurber?
Oh yeah, she was a fascinating figure. I'm not so sure that she played an instrumental role in popularizing Wagner per se, but certainly classical music. She came up with this idea for a national conservatory, which was relatively short-lived. But in the course of that, Dvorak was hired, and that was the reason that Dvorak came to America and wrote the New World Symphony. And so she also actually was progressive in terms of bringing African-American students to the conservatory. And so she felt that that was a role to be played in terms of encouraging disadvantaged minorities to study music. So she's actually a wonderfully progressive figure. Ultimately, the conservatory idea didn't survive, and then there were all kinds of just financial and practical problems with it. But women played a great role in musical culture in the 19th century and sort of into the early 20th century. And I should look up, off the top of my head, I don't know about her attitudes toward Wagner particularly, but I'm sure she probably was an enthusiast. But there were a number of other women who identified with Wagner and identified with his great female characters, Brunhilde and Isolde, and saw him as a progressive force in that sense. And so it's an interesting, perhaps somewhat unexpected side of Wagner's influence in America, particularly. So yeah, Janet Thurber, a great figure. I also wanted to acknowledge Theresa Dolan, who's the person who said that no matter how late you come to a performance of Tristan, there are still 2 more acts. I'm not sure who that is, but it's a wonderful witticism. Theresa Dolan, who I have not met, but whose work I very much admire. She wrote a wonderful book about Wagner and Manet, explicating Wagner's influence in the field of the French visual arts. A very, very important book, and one that I leaned on quite heavily in my chapter on French Wagnerism. So I just wanted to greet her from afar. But yeah, I think we do need to wrap things up. But thank you so much, Simon. This was an absolute delight. We could have gone on for hours longer in Wagnerian fashion, but you need to eat dinner and other people need to eat lunch. But thank you so much. And of course, I have to thank you for the absurdly generous words that you gave to my book in the review and airmail. I will never be able to repay that debt. So thank you so much.
Thank you.
All right, goodbye, everyone. Thank you for listening and watching.